Hello folks, today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off, and
Hello folks,
that's partly because
today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off, and
hello folks,
that's partly because
today I'm a
little bit alone.
I
gave my son the rest of the day off
because I want to cover.
Hello folks, that's partly because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks, that's partly because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks, that's partly because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks, that's partly because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks, that's partly because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks, that's partly because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks, that's partly because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks, that's partly because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks,
Can you hear me?
because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks,
Can you hear me?
because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off. Hello folks,
Can you hear me?
because today I'm a little bit alone. I gave my son the rest of the day off.
The screen is bust. What exactly do you mean? Can you write? Can you hear me? The screen is bust. What exactly do you mean? Can you write? Can you hear? You can't hear me? Audio. What exactly do you mean? Can you write? Can you hear? You can't hear me? Oh, there's a. Oh, what is that sound? Can't hear me? Oh, there's a. Oh, what is that sound? Can't hear me? Oh, there's a. Oh my God. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, let me begin again. If you can hear me, please send me a note if you can't hear me, if something gets interrupted. Okay? Okay, let's begin again. Anyways, what I was saying, for those who didn't hear me, I gave my son the rest of the day off, and that's because I want to talk about a subject which is the ether. Okay? And I was saying that the ether and another counterbalance to that, which are the four primary elements, they were discussed together with other subjects by many cultures and in different regions of the planet. And one thing that has happened over the years is that we dropped the ball. We stopped talking about these things in a meaningful way. In other words, the people who are not talking about these things, are the people who should be talking about them, which are the scientists, which are the physicists. And the people who are actually talking about it more in a historical sense are the philosophers. And in the last 2,000 years, for what I can tell at least, if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, etc., they haven't made any progress. Essentially, we're still stuck with Plato and Aristotle. So there's been little progress. And let me put a little comment which I liked. I read it while doing my research, and I kind of liked it because it summarizes exactly what has happened over the centuries, from, say, the Greeks to our days. We really dropped the ball. And here's the statement. Here's what this guy says. And he says, let me put that over here if I can. The Parmenides of Plato belongs to a stage of philosophy which has passed away. Absolutely love that statement because I think it summarizes quite a bit. At first we read it with a purely antiquarian or historical interest, and with difficulty throw ourselves back into a state of the human mind in which unity and being occupied the attention of philosophers. They were concerned about these things, right? Plato is carrying on a process which is not either useless or unnecessary in any age of philosophy. We fail to understand him because we do not realize that the questions which he is discussing could have had any value or importance. We suppose them to be like the speculations of some of the schoolmen, which end in nothing. But in truth, he is trying to get rid of the stumbling blocks of thought which beset his contemporaries, and also beseech our contemporaries. If they remain unexamined, as in a mathematical demonstration, all that flows from them is affected, and the error pervades knowledge far and wide. And I like these statements, especially the first one and the last one. If it belongs to a stage of philosophy which has passed away, and if they remain unanswered, if we unexamined or unanswered, if we don't do something about all this, they form the foundations, and it's going to affect what it says there. All that flows from them is affected, and the error pervades knowledge far and wide. Absolutely love that synthesis, and so the question here is, what are these the moderns doing about this? And the answer is they're not doing anything. We still don't know. Here I have one of my books of physics when I was in high school. This is a long time ago, and when I read it, in the first few pages, I find no mention of what an object is, what things are made of. We don't know what motion is. There's no definition. Obviously, there's no definition of distance or location. We don't know what exist means. And these words are used subsequently throughout the book indirectly or directly in one way or another. And it's like we have no idea what these words mean or how to use them. We think we know because we say object and everybody says, oh, I know what he's talking about. Emotion, yeah, I know what he's talking about. And we don't, because nobody has defined these words. And it turns out that the Greeks among them spent a lot of time on them. They spent a lot of time debating, and even though we have fragments from what they wrote, we can get a pretty good picture that there was a big debate going on, an intergenerational debate going on between them. But it didn't start there. When I look at where some of these notions came from, the earliest I can see is about the 6th century BC. Okay, 600 years before Christ. That's when some people started writing about these subjects. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind is that there was an oral tradition before then, and that I don't think these concepts were born in the 6th century. Perhaps if we could travel in time, we would go back and find out that some little old guy out there that is not even mentioned in history was probably the originator of some of these ideas. They were passed on along from generation to generation, and eventually someone wrote them down. And the guy who we credit today is the guy who wrote them down. But they were probably not the originators. But again, that's a trivial issue. The question is that these people were involved in analyzing the nature of the universe. And one of the first examples that I find, or one of the first notions of what things are comprised of, and you probably heard it, earth, fire, air, and water. And here I find one instance, and it comes from the Upanishads, and they're Sanskrit texts that underlie both Hinduism and Buddhism. And this is the statement. It says, from this very self did space come into being. From space, air. From air, fire. From fire, the waters. From the waters, the earth. From the earth, plants. From plants, food. And from food, man. Okay, so that's about the first statement that you get in history relating to at least the 4 primary elements. Now, it turns out this is the 6th century BC, and that's an estimate. This is not ground in stone. There are debates on when the Upanishads were written. In the West, we get Mr. What's his name? Empedocles. See if I can find him here. Empedocles, and he says the following. You can see the date there when he was approximately born in the 5th century there. And he came up with a notion of air, water, earth, and fire. He's the first one to propose that. And in modern days, you can relate those to gas, liquid, solid, and what we could call energy or plasma. They didn't know what fire was. They just thought it was some kind of basic element. And let me move this a little bit aside here. And what characteristics did these elements have for him? They were simple, eternal, unchanging. Change is the result of the mixture and separation of these elements. And divine powers bring about mixture. But the divine powers are love, which blends, which brings together, and separation is caused by strife. So we have these 2 major deities, these 2 things that belong to the gods. One is love and the other one is strife, love and war. And one produces friendliness, mixture, blending, and the other one creates separation and war, people, hostility, right? And as you can see, what's missing there, and again, we're talking about 500 years BC, what's missing there is the ether, or you could call it space, or whatever was out there in space, some kind of element, some kind of smoke, some kind of spirit, whatever was out there. It's kind of missing from his listing of elements, but he was referring really to the material elements, okay? one of the guys that comes in next and it expands upon this is Parmenides. And Parmenides says the following. And again, he wrote in poems, right? He says, and there's only one poem from him, okay, that survives. The rest that we know from Parmenides comes from other Greeks who, over the centuries, quoted him, among them Plato, and I think Aristotle as well. And so this is the only fragment we have. In those days, it was customary to write in poetry. So not only did you have to make sense of the universe, but you had to put it in some poetic form. Like, if you look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, written in a poetic manner. So what does Parmenides say? There is a gate that, oh, by the way, Parmenides, the reason he can say all this with certain authority is what precedes this. The longer part of the story says that he was taken by a goddess to see all these things. He was shown the truth of the world, of what is real. So he came back after that, he had one of these trips. He comes back and now he can tell us with authority that this is what the gods intended or what they have up there. There is the gate that divides the paths of night and day, and a lintel and a threshold of stone delimit it from above and below. It, erected in the ether, right, the ether now, is closed by large shutters. You will know the ether's nature, and in the ether all the signs and the unseen works of the pure torch of the brilliant sun, and from whence they came to be, and you will learn the wandering works of the round-eyed moon and its nature, and you will know too the surrounding heaven, both whence it grew, and how necessity, directing it, bound it to furnish the limits of the stars. And in the next fragment, he says, how the earth and sun and moon and the shared ether and the heavenly milk and Olympus outermost. He brings into the picture the ether. And the ether, he does not define it very well. He's going through this trip. Who knows what kind of drugs they use in those days. He goes through this trip and he comes back and he says the ether. Okay, there's something out there called the ether. Well, this is later formalized by, let's see if I can see it here. This is formalized by Mr. Anaxagoras. Okay, and Anaxagoras lived about the same time, and he says air and ether covered all things. So it gets a little more technical here. Here the ether covers all things, both being unlimited, for these are the greatest among all things, both in amount and in largeness. So we have a better idea now of what the ether might be. It's something that covers all things. Okay, so the ether was kicked around. And so one of the issues that came around is, what is the ether? What do we mean by this? Someone is going to define this. And today we have an idea what it means. It says the word ether in Greek meant to burn, to incinerate, to shine. So it had to do with fire. It was like a godly fire, a heavenly fire, a holy fire. And it's conceived as a pure form of fire, okay? And it's a substance of which the stars and planets are made, according to the Greeks, okay? So this was the idea that was developing. There was this mist, this thing out there called the ether. And that kind of was a counterbalance to what was here, which was the fire, the water, the air, and the earth. So you had the ether out there and these four elements down here. And more or less, that's how eventually this develops and is transmitted from generation to generation. We have Plato, and he talks about the four elements, okay? He reinforces his, in the revolution, let me make this a little bigger so I can see it. In the revolution of the universe are comprehended all the four elements. And this being circular and having a tendency to come together compresses everything and will not allow any place to be left void. So it covers everything, okay? Wherefore, also fire above all things penetrates everywhere, and air next, as being next in rarity of the elements. And the two other elements, in like manner, penetrate according to their degrees of rarity. For those things which are composed of the largest particles have the largest void left in their composition, and those which are composed of the smallest particles have the least. And the contraction caused by the compression thrusts the smaller particles into the interstices of the larger. And thus, when the small parts are placed side by side with the larger, and the lesser divide the greater, and the greater unite the lesser, all the elements are borne up and down and hither and thither towards their own places. For the change in the size of each changes its position in space. So he's talking about size, and you know how these particles have size and they kind of interfere with each other. And these causes generate an inequality which is always maintained and is continually creating a perpetual motion of the elements in all time. Okay? And he continues, I think I have another quote from him here. He says, I think he defines it here. He says there are diverse kinds of fire. There are, for example, first, flame, and secondly, those emanations of flame which do not burn, but only give light to the eyes. These were the notions that they had. Thirdly, the remains of fire, which are seen in red-hot embers after the flame has been extinguished. There are similar differences in the air, of which the translucent kind is called the ether, and the most turbid sort, mist and darkness. What he's saying is that the ether is somewhere in here on Earth. Okay, it's among these four elements, but he still hasn't quite defined what this ether is. He's just throwing this around. It's not until we get to Aristotle that we get a more formalized idea of what this ether becomes. And what Aristotle does essentially is he puts the ether into outer space, beyond the moon specifically. He's saying the moon goes around the earth, and beyond the moon, that's where the ether is. The ether has nothing to do with the four elements, as Plato suggested, and the four elements have nothing to do with the ether. Okay, this is what Aristotle's going to come up with. Let's see if we can get this. So Aristotle says the following. He says, there can be no contrary motion to the circular nature. Seems to just, let me get this a little bigger. Justly to have exempted from contraries the body ether, which has to be ungenerated and indestructible. So according to Aristotle, it's something really that has no origin and cannot be destroyed. No beginning, no end, no alpha, no omega. The primary body is eternal and not subject to increase or diminution, but unchanging and unalterable and unmodified. The primary body is something else beyond earth, fire, air, and water. They gave the highest place a name of its own, and he calls it the ether. But he's not going to use that word, by the way. He only mentions it a couple times here. Derived from the fact that it runs always for an eternity of time. It's a flame that runs forever. Anaxagoras, he's referring to the other fellow, his predecessor, however, scandalously misuses this name, taking ether as equivalent to fire. So what Aristotle does, I think he's going to do that in the next quote here. It says, well, it's a summary of what Aristotle said. He wrote a lot. The element of the stars fills the entire heavenly region from first heaven to the moon. First heaven is beyond the moon, so from the first heaven to the moon. It is never to be found in the region occupied by the other four elements. It's divine, eternal, unchanging, and has circular motion with which he explains celestial motion. They were aware that, the earth was going around the sun or the sun around the earth, one of the two, and it was all circular. It was like recurrent. Every day, the same thing happened, so they figured out their circular motion, and they're saying that's due to the ether. At least Aristotle is saying that. Okay, so the ether now is being transformed from an original idea that was some kind of mist out there that was maybe in between fire and air and earth and water, and now Aristotle puts it way beyond the earth. He says down here there's no ether, the ether's out there. Okay, so he's the first one to kind of separate these notions or these concepts. So we get to Mr. Crispus. Again, Aristotle is, 3rd century BC, 3rd and 4th. Here we get to the 3rd century BC, maybe 50 years later. Aristotle was Alexander the Great's teacher, and he died about the same time. They died at 323 BC. So we're talking about really the 4th century. Here we get to the 3rd century, and we have Crispus. And he's got this Stoic idea, and the Stoics were supposedly materialists because they believe that a body that exists is one that can be acted upon or that can act upon another one. So only those things that can interface physically, those are the ones that, according to the Stoics, existed. And that means that they, and you might say, well, did love exist? Well, they turned a lot of these things into solids, into physical things, and they said, yeah, love exists because, it's a body. And so the question is, a lot of these things are very nebulous because they turn some concepts into objects, and then they say, see, it can act upon something. So the Stoics had a little bit of a contradiction there. And then Crispus is the guy who invents the pneuma, and the pneuma is essentially the ether. In other words, it's the breath of the gods. It's the mist that comes out of their holiness, out of their magic wands, and it's a fiery air or breath that gives life to things, where the word is closely linked to the ether. Okay, and pneuma is here is where they differ with the Epicureans, who maintain that, like Democritus, who was not an Epicurean or even a Stoic. He came before those times, but Democritus is famous for saying, that there's this indivisible, which we're going to call the atom. That's what the word atom means, indivisible. And so he saw this universe as a bunch of discrete little balls, pretty much like the quantum mechanics fellows of today, right? And here's where these guys, the Stoics, disagree with them. They say, look, it's not that there's all these little particles. They're saying there's this pneuma, and the pneuma is continuous. Okay, so we have the continuous guys against the discrete guys, essentially. That's the separation there. And that's where Crispus comes up with this notion, and it's this same pneuma that is going to be identified with the ether. They said, look, we've already discussed that. We already invented the ether. Now he calls it the pneuma, which is essentially a breath of life, right? That comes from the gods. But here's the critical point. The critical point is now the ether takes on more a religious character. Now we're going to talk about the relationship of pneuma in terms of the soul. So he says, I don't have it there, but essentially he's the first guy who begins talking more about how the pneuma is the breath of life, or fiery breath, that the gods are imbuing matter with, us, specifically us. living matter specifically. Even though the pneuma apparently, is in everything. It's in the stones, it's in everything. But in us, it gives us life. And what is the pneuma? Well, it's going to be the soul. Eventually, that's going to be evolve into, or it's going to develop into the soul. Okay? And about 400 years later, now we're talking about the Christian era, the ether gets more and more religious. Okay, I don't know if you can read that there. Let me make it a little bigger. Wiseman, this is what Plotinus says. He says, Wiseman called this body, and he's referring to the ether here, the vehicle of the soul. Okay, so he's going to take this ether that was out beyond the moon, put out there by Aristotle. He's going to bring it in. He says, no, look, this ether is really what makes us live, what makes us breathe. It's the foundation of our soul. Okay, so now the ether is going to leave physics a little bit and leave the scientific path it was in, and it's going to come more into the religious path. They're going to talk more about the soul in terms of the ether. And he says, vehicle of the soul, that is, an ethereal body is taken out of the ether. And he's referring to Aristotle's ether. Okay, but he says that, that mist is now coming to earth. The stone which the philosophers do seek is an indivisible and impalpable spirit. Stars indicate rather than cause phenomena such as the inclinations and qualities of humans. Stars. What is he referring to? Well, he's getting a little bit into astrology here. We're starting to not only talk about the souls of men, but about how the stars affect men. And why? Because the ether in which the stars bathe or swim or whatever, it goes through the stars, through the planets, and then comes to us. And so we have this influence from the stars. Okay? And so now we're starting to get, again, people are more concerned about the soul and how the ether makes its way to us, to our hearts or to our stomachs or to whatever, our brains, and fills us with this life-giving magic, and it's also what makes us live. Okay, so the ether has to do more now, not so much with matter, with the physical, with the scientific path that we could have followed. Now, as we approach the Dark Ages, it's getting more into, Christianity, into what does it do for the soul, okay, or how it's related to the soul. And we get to Mr. Marciano, 5th century here. And again, he blesses fire, water, and air. In fact, he draws it. I don't know if you can see that there. Let me make it bigger just for a second so that you can see it better. But he's got water. That's aqua. That's water. Outside, he's got air. Inside, I think this is either terra or fire. It's not very clear what he wrote there. But essentially, he's saying there are concentric circles of all this stuff, right? Oh, wrong one. There's concentric circles of each one of these chemical elements. But he says, yeah, everything is, we still were thinking in terms of fire, water, earth, and air, right? And he just says, that there's these concentric circles of these elements around the earth. And, but he doesn't get rid of the ether, quite the contrary. He's going to take the ether and also put it in line with Christianity, with God, with the Bible, right? And so he's got to make sense of what Plato and Aristotle and all these guys are saying at the same time. He has to fit it within religion, and that's how ether is now progressing. And he says entire zodiac firmament rotates around Earth. So he's got, now we're getting into this astrological world where the stars not only influence us, but they realize that, that the Earth throughout the year passes through different constellations. So now they're beginning to say, well, these stars were here in March, they're again in March, so now they see a cycle. And they're saying, the guy who's born around this time, he's being influenced by these stars because, again, the ether, was coming from the stars. It was penetrating the space between the moon and the earth. It was reaching our brains and doing something to us. Whoever was born on that day was being influenced by that ether. Okay? And it says, ether is the fifth medium around which sun, moon, planets, and stars of the zodiac circle, and rotation of the universe shapes elements into spheres. Okay, so now we get this perfect geometric figure called a sphere. Why is it a sphere? Well, because, so much circling, it kind of polishes and, forms it into a circular form. That was the notion these people had. And you can see they do try to draw circles, and the circle and the sphere become prominent within this whole astrology religion that is being born here. Okay? And I'm going to skip a couple steps because I have some material to cover. So I'll jump directly to this individual. And he lives about 1,000 years later. There were people in between. You've got St. Augustine. You got John the Grammarian. There's several people in between there, but they all pretty much say the same thing. They take the ether, they put it in terms of religion, in terms of astrology, and by the time you reach the 15th century here, A.D., you start mixing it with another religion that's being born, which is the chemistry, the mixture of, what was it called? I forgot the word. Alchemy. They start mixing chemicals, and now that also comes into play because of the four elements, because now they discover that there's also sulfur and mercury, and that they have kind of different properties, and they kind of separate them from the traditional four. So there's these four plus sulfur and mercury. And of course, they're also going to include salt eventually, right? And here's this Pacino, that's his name. Italian guy, as you can see, and let me see if I make it a little bigger. It says the Magi, the Zoroastrians, right, call this body the vehicle of the soul. Again, repeating to some degree what others had already gone through, right? The same train of thought. Call it the vehicle of the soul. That is the ethereal body received from the ether, the soul's immortal garment. It is round. Again, we have circular, spherical. They like that shape. It is round, and partly because roundness has this infinity quality to it. You can run around it forever, right? It is round in its natural shape because of the roundness of the ethereal region, but it transforms itself into our angular human shape when it enters the human body and restores itself to its former shape when it departs from it. The ether comes in here, and it's round, but then it's in the human body. It takes the shape of the body or gets some different shape, whatever. Throughout life, when you die, it goes back to where it was. And here's a synthesis, which I got because there's a lot of reading material. A spiritual entity arriving from the stars serves as the vehicle for the soul that enters the hearts of humans upon birth. This ethereal medium determines an individual's horoscope and fate. Okay, so it determines your future. So you better be born on the right date. Ask your mother. And the soul is initially round, deforms after it enters the body, and round again when we die. Okay, so that's the cycle of the ether within your body. Okay, and by the way, this alchemist, he was one of the early guys who, you could say, tried to do it scientifically, and so he was quite popular and respected in his day within the scientific community of the day. Okay, and some of this also had to do, and you keep always this in mind, it had to do with medicine. People had ailments. They would come to see these guys because these were the physicians of the day. They were the witch doctors in the cities. And people would visit them and say, look, I got my ear hurts or my chest hurts. And the guy would mix maybe, I don't know, mercury with salt and say, drink this. It'll cure all your ills. And they did these kinds of things. They were alchemists. They were mixing things in their lab. They were mad scientists in the basement, working in the basement. And so they came up with these ideas based on some of the things that they did in the labs. Okay. And here's another one from Mr. Pacino. And he says, he's getting more philosophical about it here. The stone is a fifth separated from four. In other words, the four elements, the stone, he's going to talk about the ether, which is the fifth stone. And by the way, if I get it correctly, Aristotle did not consider it the fifth element, the quintessential. He considered it the first element. The other four came later. Here we have it in reverse. The stone is a fifth separated from four. It is the bond of the elements, the medium and the chain which has made the elements of God agree, and which in the womb of the earth conglutinated sulfur and mercury into a metallic body, such a bond is invisible. Okay, so he's going to mix them, but he's going to say that the thing that's going to mix, that's going to serve as the thing that melts them or that puts them together or that blends them together, is an invisible thing. And again, the ether is invisible, okay, but it does all kinds of things. The spirit, and that's what he's going to call it, and he's going to separate spirit from soul. Keep this in mind, okay? The spirit is also the tie of the soul and the body. He says, in other words, the body is tied to the soul through the spirit. It's the spirit that's going to form the soul in your body, okay? So the spirit is separate from the soul. And as it were, the ethereal chariot or vehicle of the soul, which spreads abroad the virtue of the soul through the whole body. You may also understand the four elements when the philosophers affirm that when the philosophers got lost here. You may also understand the four elements when the philosophers affirm that the stone consists of body, spirit, and soul. So he separates those, okay? For the water is spirit, also air. The middle, fire, as I may say, is spirit. The earth we call not spirit, but body, because it is the retainer, the matter, and the seat of the other elements, okay? So what Ficino is introducing here, again, he's an astrologer, he's an alchemist, and obviously a philosopher in the traditional Platonic or Greek sense, okay? And he separates the spirit from the soul and the soul from the body, okay? And he says that the spirit, when the soul comes in, when the soul comes in, where the ether comes in, really, and enters your body, it's a soul, but it's the spirit that's going to form the soul inside your body. So now that your soul has a form inside your body, now you die, and both the spirit and the soul leave your body. Okay, now the spirit and the soul both leave your body. The spirit goes back to God, and the soul dissipates. I think that's the way it is, or maybe it's the other way around. Let me see. I think I've got it here. No, I've got it, after that I've got it with Paracelsus. Okay, but I know that one of those two, can't remember which now, but the spirit goes back to God, and that's the guy that molded the soul. And the soul, and the soul recovers its ethereal body or form, which is round. So this is the cycle. The cycle is ether penetrates your body, and it comes in as a circular or rounded shape. Inside your body, the spirit molds it so that the soul now takes on the body, the shape of your body, or maybe some other shape, who knows. And now when you die, both the spirit and the soul leave. The soul goes back to God. The spirit goes back to God. But the soul goes back to what it was, which is the shape of the ether, roundness. And the spirit becomes, this is the funny part, the spirit becomes the nothingness of God. So God sends nothingness to mold your soul. When you're done with, the spirit goes back to God and becomes nothing again. that was the notions these people created. Very complex in a sense, but this is what was going through their minds, one thing. And the other one is that, as you can see, they're relating it ever more into religion, into the soul. They forget about what the ether is, or whether it hits walls, or what the elements are made out of. They're just concerned about the soul. And part of that has to do with, again, with medicine, the fact that people would visit them and they had to create these philosophies to find out, how they were going to cure people. They had a real problem in front of them, and they tried to solve it with some of these explanations. And we arrived to someone who came just a short while afterwards, and that's Paracelsus. And he's quite more known than this previous guy, the Pacino. And Paracelsus says matter is comprised of fire, water, air, and earth. Okay, so everybody believed in this idea, even up to the 16th century, I would say, right, and beyond. Ether is the stuff of starlight and souls. Again, tying what's out there in the stars, all these planets, all these stars, they're made out of ether, and that same stuff is what we're made of, or our souls are made out of, right? Matter and ether are both substances. So the ether is now turned into a substance, or at least he claims that it is, without saying what a substance is, but he's thinking of the ether as something material. They visualize it, as far as I can tell, as a mist, as some kind of vapor. That's, I think, how they visualize this. And they say this vapor, this holy vapor or material, this smoke, comes from beyond the stars, bringing all this starlight, all this stuff from the stars into our body. And because it comes from the stars, we are influenced by the stars. You heard of the flu. In fact, I had the flu twice this year. Terrible stuff. And I still have a little bit of cough. And we have we have these what was I saying? No, I forgot my train of thought there. Anyways, these people had to relate it to the soul, and again they had to relate it to health, because they had to cure people. And so they tied the ether to the soul, and also said, I was saying about the influenza, that you call it the flu. It comes from the word influenza, which means that you are influenced. What were you influenced by? The stars. And it all related to the ether. The ether came from the stars, and if you got a cold, it was because you were influenced by the stars. And what else could that be if not the ether? So it was all tied together, this whole philosophy, and it lasted many centuries. And by the way, another interesting point, if you're interested, Ethiopia comes from the word ether, because the ether, really Ethiopian, the word meant burnt, and Ethiopian means burnt face. They referred to black people as Ethiopians in general, and it came from the fact that they had burnt faces, black faces. There was a regiment in the Revolutionary War around 1775, guy by the name of Dunsmore, I think, Lord Dunsmore. He was the last governor of Virginia. And this fellow, in order to fight the revolutionaries, the Americans who were trying to fight for their liberty, he was a British guy, and so he said, look, we don't have enough personnel, so why don't we do the following? And he said, put the note out there, I guess was spread through the grapevine, and they said, any black who wants to gain his liberty, wants to gain his freedom from their plantation owners, all he has to do is join our regiment. And so a lot of blacks left their masters. They thought it was a good idea, and they joined the regiment. The regiment was called Ethiopian Regiment because they were all black-faced. And the notion of Ethiopian also lasted all the way up to the Civil War, where it was used as a polite way of referring to blacks. The term black American did not exist at the time. And so they called them Ethiopians. Black-faced people, they were called Ethiopians. And that term has gone into disuse. But Ethiopian means blackface, and it's got to do with burnt face, from the word burnt, that's what ether means. Anyways, getting back here, it says matter and ether are both substances. Ether, soul, okay, it's identified with the soul, is initially chaotic. Spirit is what gives it form. Ether returns to its original form, chaos. So it goes back to all this mess, this disorder, after the body dies. Meanwhile, the immortal quintessence, or spirit that gave it form, becomes the nothingness of God. So the spirit goes back to God, and the soul goes not to heaven, I guess, or maybe it does, because that was like a heaven for them. The soul goes back to where it was, which is the ether that forms the mist that on which all the planets and stars out there, on which they rotate. So there's this medium called the ether. You got to think of it as maybe a wheel, firmament. They're stuck to this medium, and this medium every now and then comes to Earth, visits us, goes into our bodies as the soul, and the spirit comes over, molds it, shapes it, forms it. Now you die, and one goes back to God, becomes nothing, the nothingness of God. And the other one goes back to being a sphere of some kind and forms the ether, which is where the stars dwell. So that's in a nutshell what happened with the ether up to that point. And you might think that, now we get into the 17th century and you get to the scientific revolution, and you would think that all these new guys, say, well, okay, we're going to let go of this ether, and we're going to do some real science. They didn't. Here we have Mr. Newton, Isaac Newton, and he has the following. This is long, so I've got it in two pieces, so I'll open it up like that. He writes a letter to Robert Hooke in 1678. Look how late it is, right? Almost late 17th century. And he says, let ABCD be a dense body, whether opaque or transparent. EFGH, by the way, it's going to be here. I'm going to show it in a second, so do not despair. The outside of the uniform ether, which is within it. If IKLM, the inside of the uniform ether, which is without it. And conceive the ether which is between EFGH and JKLM, to run through all the intermediate degrees of density between that of the two uniform ethers on either side. This being supposed, the rays of the sun, SB, SK, which pass by the edge of this body between B and K, ought in their passage through the unequally dense ether there to receive a ply from the denser ether which is on that side towards K. And that the more by how much they pass near to the body, and thereby to the scattered through the space PQRST, as by experience they are found to be. Now the space between the limits EFGH, IKLM, I shall call the space of the ether's graduated rarity. What did he say? Well, he says, look, here you have the sun, and here you have the rays, and this is passing by an object. On the inside here, EFGH, that's ether. And on the outside, IKLM or JKLM, right, you have ether. So these dotted lines are the ether that surround any body. A body has ether on the inside and on the outside, okay? And the way Newton saw this is this ether has different densities. And the densities get closer to the edge of the body, and farther away they get less dense, thinner, right? So when the rays of the sun, here we have light, coming around, for example, between the ether on the inside, between point F and K, it gets twisted on the inside because the density of the ether is greater in that area. So it's the density of the ether that bends the rays of the sun. That's how Newton envisioned it originally. And, people don't like to mention that they're great. Newton was talking about the ether. It's like, what's this guy? This guy's in the days of the Greeks, he made no progress since then. He's talking about the ether in the 17th century, this mathematician who discovered gravity and all the laws of motion, all that. So they had a hard time, and so they don't usually talk about this very much. Okay, but in his book on optics, which was published in 1730, right, which is the next century, beginning of the next century, shortly before he died, or I think it was published after he died, but he did publish it while he was alive. I think there 1730 is perhaps another edition. And I'm not sure, maybe it was even published posthumously. But this is the issue. The issue is, where do I have this? This is what Newton says in optics. The small, so we're talking about, he made some progress. You said, well, that was the 17th century. Here we're talking about the 18th century, still with the ether. He says the smallness of the rays of light may contribute very much to the power of the agent by which they are refracted. And so if anyone should suppose that ether, like our air, may contain particles which endeavor to recede from one another, for I do not know what this ether is, and that its particles are exceedingly smaller than those of air, or even than those of light. So light is not the ether, right? The exceeding smallness of its particles may contribute to the greatness of the force by which those particles may recede from one another. What Newton is saying, that there's a medium out there independent of light, and you can see it in that picture, in the previous picture here, right? You can see it that if this is the object and this is light, the ether, these dotted lines, they're separate from the rays of light. Okay? So if light is made of particles, these particles are going through the ether. It's a different medium. Ether is, assuming he imagined it as a bunch of particles, we have this medium, but light is a bunch of other particles which, because of their size, can go through the ether. Okay, so that's how he envisioned it. He envisioned the corpuscles of light being separate from the ether, the medium through which they traveled, and which obviously, according to Newton, filled all of space. Okay, so he writes that in optics here, right? And have another thing on Mr. Newton, I think. No, I don't. That was it. Okay, so essentially, the important part here is, again, that the particles that Newton talks about, the corpuscles, that, according to him, formed light, they are separate from the ether. This notion, this idea, is going to change completely by the time we get to the 19th century. And you get people like Augustin Fresnel, the French researcher who tried to figure out how polarization works. And he also tried to figure out and wrote papers on how the slit experiment worked. So he's the guy who comes up with these two ideas of the slit experiment, of explanations for him, right? And for polarization. And he was given quite a few medals because of his dedication to those two subjects. But how did they see it? Well, starting with people like Thomas Young and Arago, the other French guy, and Fresnel, and onwards, they all started visualizing the ether as the exact medium that vibrated. And light was a vibration of the ether, something that was not the same type of ether that Newton was thinking of. Newton was saying, look, this ether is out there, there's this medium. He probably visualized a bunch of particles, but the particles of light had the ability to vibrate that ether and pass through it. So it didn't stop light. In fact, it permitted the passage of light because of the differences in size. But it was that same ether that, when in great concentrations, in higher density, that bent the rays of light. That was his notion of how this worked. You can probably laugh at Newton today, but I think in that sense you got to give him credit that at least the guy was trying to break his brain to find out how this universe worked, and that I have a lot of respect for. But again, 19th century, that changes. Now the ether becomes the medium that vibrates, and that is light. And here we have, we'll skip a couple here so that we can move on. Here we have Mr. Maxwell, okay? And I think he's the guy who pretty much states it in the most comprehensive way. And again, almost towards the end of the 19th century. He says, in several parts of this treatise, an attempt has been made to explain electromagnetic phenomena by means of mechanical action transmitted from one body to another by means of a medium occupying the space between them. Okay? The undulatory theory of light also assumes the existence of a medium. We have now to show that the properties of the electromagnetic medium are identical with those of the luminiferous medium. In other words, he's saying the famous luminiferous medium, ether, is the light is the vibration of that same medium. They are one and the same. That's what Maxwell is saying. What, in 1873? That's how far in time we were still talking about the ether in terms of trying to explain light with it. Newton said, the particles are going through the ether. Maxwell is saying no. It's the vibration. Light is the vibration of the ether. There's this medium out there. Well, this kind of all fell apart when Mr. Michelson and Morley, they came up and they did a little experiment, as most of you probably know. And it's the famous Michelson-Morley experiment on the ether, and they essentially discovered that no matter how they put their little device, their detector, they didn't detect any ether out there in space. And no matter how they positioned it, there was no preferential direction of light. Light was not stopped in any direction, and they assumed that if the light had to traverse the ether, it would have been bent like Newton suggested, or even like Maxwell. And in a letter to Lord Rayleigh, he says, the experiments on the relative motion, this is Michelson writing the letter, and remember, it's just a few years after Maxwell wrote his treatise. The experiments on the relative motion of the earth and ether have been completed, and the result decidedly negative. Okay, the expected deviation of the interference fringes from the zero should have been 0.4 of a fringe. The maximum displacement was 0.02 and the average much less than 0.01. And then not in the right place. As displacement is proportional to squares of the relative velocities, it follows that if the ether does slip past the relative velocity, is less than 1/6 of the Earth's velocity. Anyways, he justifies to Lord Rayleigh that, in his opinion, after taking all these measurements, and he did the experiment, by the way, more than once, okay, and he wrote a couple papers, not one. And in both instances, in all instances, really, he maintained that there is no ether out there. And so this kind of destroyed Maxwell's idea that light was the vibration of the ether. And it kind of destroyed also Newton, because Newton says, well, light is going through the ether, and it's the density of the ether that is pulling the ray of light inwards. And if there's no ether out there, well, these guys are talking in vain, because that means, light is not being bent by the ether, and light is not the vibration of the ether. And so Michelson really threw a wrench into the workings of the ether, anyone who mentioned the ether. And who comes next? Well, we have Mr. Einstein, and he writes a paper, his famous paper of 1905, one of the 4 papers that he writes that year, Mirabilis, Annus Mirabilis. And he says, the introduction of a luminiferous ether will prove to be superfluous, inasmuch as the view here to be developed will not require an absolute stationary space. And here he's talking about the relationship to this mist that's out there. And he says there's no mist. Okay, we don't need it, he says. provided with special properties, nor assign a velocity vector to a point of the empty space in which electromagnetic processes take place. Okay, he writes that in there, so he kind of gets in line with what Michelson discovered, and people are getting this idea, had already made up their minds that maybe there is no ether, and so they say, well, if there is no ether, I better get in line with these people, get on the boat, toe the party line and say the same thing. There is no ether, but Einstein's saying, I don't need it. I don't need the ether. That's what he says in 1905. But then he comes in 1920, and another famous paper of his, where he talks to the faculty in Leiden, Germany, and he says, according to the general theory of relativity, which came in 1916, space without ether is unthinkable. Period. We could almost stop there. For in such space there would be no propagation of light. We got a little bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, he says, I don't need the ether. Now he's saying, look, if we don't have an ether, we don't have any propagation of light. He could not make sense of the propagation of light without some kind of medium. And he's going back to Maxwell. He's saying, maybe this ether is the vibration of the ether. This light is the vibration of the ether. And so this is what he says in 1920, 15 years after he wrote his first paper. But this ether may not be thought of and endowed with a quality characteristic of ponderable media, as consisting of parts. This is important for all these people who say the ether is made out of little particles, okay? It doesn't consist of part. In other words, I guess he's saying it's continuous, right? Which may be tracked through time. So you cannot think of the ether as little particles. And he adds, the idea of motion may not be applied to it. In other words, if the ether, if there is an ether out there, it's some kind of continuous medium. The rope, maybe? I don't know. Just getting my hopes up here. It's a continuous medium. It cannot be made of particles, and you cannot assign motion to those particles. You cannot say that there's vibrating ether in the background, which is what quantum holds today. That there's this vacuum, this false vacuum energy, whatever they want to call it, and they've got all the virtual particles coming in and out of the void. So the current idea is that there's some kind of energy, ether out there in space, filling space. They don't want to mention the word because it's a no-no, it's a taboo to mention the word ether. But that's what it is. It's a universe where space is filled with this ether stuff. But according to Mr. Einstein here, 1920, right? He says that this ether cannot be seen as made of discrete particles that can move, that vibrate or whatever. It's got to be seen as a continuous medium. And again, none of his ideas were taken seriously. Nobody bothered to look at Einstein's ether. It got buried in the ash heap of history. And today we use the ether. Quantum mechanics uses the ether in the sense that Einstein was negating, the way he was opposing. He was saying, there is no bunch of particles out there filling space, which is currently the version that quantum uses. They say, space is not only made of particles, but these particles come in from the void, whatever the void is, and they make themselves known or seen or detected just to get the equations right. Then they go back into nothingness, whatever nothingness is. And so it's the ether. Again, and the ether hasn't died. It's still with us. But Einstein raises a good point, which is the same point that Maxwell raises and says, how can light be the vibration of nothing? So he had a problem with that, and so did Maxwell, and so did everyone since then, that has a little bit of brain inside his head. Everybody questions the same thing. How can light be the vibration of nothing? And there's a lot of people who hold that. In fact, I I can't say it's the official stance, but lots of people in the mathematical establishment say that it's the vibration of nothing. You will find that in many places on the internet. Okay, so what happened here? Mr. Born comes in, Max Born, you've heard of him. And Max Born kind of resolves the whole thing. And he writes in a book that he published in 1964, Einstein's Theory of Relativity, and he says, he doesn't say it, but this is a synthesis that the wiki has of his book, or of his conclusions, is, since the development of special relativity, 1908 thereabouts, theories using a substantial ether fell out of use in modern physics. Did they? Okay. And were replaced by more abstract models. We went from objects to concepts. That's essentially what Mr. Born is saying in different words. We stopped thinking of light and electrons and whatever as being real things, and we started talking more about, these things as abstractions, as more like numbers. You're not shaking a particle, a corpuscle, as Newton thought about it. You really have a wave of probabilities, probability wave or whatever that means. What is a probability wave? Well, again, it's like Born says here. They stopped looking at, forget about the ether, as filled with particles. Forget about the movement of something being light. No. What we're going to talk about from now on is the movement of numbers. We're going to talk about the probability, where we can find it, how we can detect it, and not what is it. And that goes back to the statement I made at the beginning here, where we lost this idea that the Greeks had in trying to elucidate. What is matter made out of? Ultimately, what is this invisible world that makes us? Well, we figured out more or less that it's made out of atoms, but that's about as far as we got, because everything else is supernatural, irrational, surrealistic. And here Born is telling you why. They moved from concreteness to abstractness. They went into abstractions. And since at least the 20s, since the time of Max Born, it's always been quite abstract. It's you read anything in mathematical physics, it's totally abstract. And they've harped more on words like as energy, mass, and so on, which are all concepts: force, field, charge. They're all concepts. And that's what they move around today. And you say, well, what is energy? What is mass? What is charge? And they can't tell you, because they can't point to it. They can't tell you, look, like they can't point to it like you point to a rock or to a tree or to a dog. They can't do that. They say, look, you got to take a course at the university to understand what I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is mass and energy and work and charge and field and time. And nobody has any idea what these words mean because they're not even defined properly. So yeah, we went into a world of abstraction, but undefined abstractions. That's important too. Okay, so is the ether dead because of this? Well, let me show you that it kind of isn't. Here I have, there's a couple of these papers running around, but I just pulled one as an example. Oh, come on. Taking a long time to get up there. Here's a paper written in, 1998. It says, an ether model based upon a degenerate fermion fluid composed primarily of electrons and positrons in a negative energy state relative to the null state or true vacuum. We have false vacuum, this is the true vacuum, is proposed, and its consequences are explored for physics and cosmology. The model provides both insight and quantitative results for a large number of phenomena, and he lists a bunch of phenomena there later on. A key assumption is that the speed of light is the Fermi velocity of the degenerate, I love the words that these guys use, electron-positron plasma that dominates the ether. So has the ether died? Well, no, people are still bringing it back to life, and again, it's because people cannot reconcile themselves to the fact that that light or anything, for that matter, the electron, cannot be the vibration of nothing. It's got to be the vibration of something. And people say, what are we going to call that something? We'll call it the ether. And then the fight is, well, what is the ether? Is it an ocean? Is it continuous? Is it discrete? Does it vibrate? Is it made of tiny little particles like Newton said, and light goes through it and has the ability to vibrate the ether as it goes through it? Is it because of the size of the particles that this one's bigger and that one's smaller? Is that what it is? So people want to know what the ether is. It's like we haven't abandoned that because no one has told us yet what light is. And when people say, well, light is a bunch of particles, we'll call them photons. And you say, okay, I understand that. And series of particles, flow of particles, we all understand that, right? No, we don't. Because it turns out when you look at the word particle doesn't mean corpuscle. It doesn't mean speck of dust. It doesn't mean even a point in that sense, or a geometric point, a little ball or whatever. No, the word particle is a value. Okay, it's a value, and so this is where we were at today. And let me finish this with one of our sister groups here that does. They called it physics. And it's the group we call the Electric Universe. And I'll split this up in two parts. It says the real nature of light. And this is by Wal Thornhill. And he's one of the gurus of the Electric Universe. And he says, in my view, the crucial difference between the near infinite speed of the electric force and the relative dawdle of light on any cosmic scale is that the electric force is longitudinal, while light is an oscillating transfer signal moving slowly through a medium. What medium could he possibly be referring to? If I can use a simple analogy, light travels slowly like the transverse ripples on a pond surface. Gravity travels swiftly and longitudinally, like the speed of sound in water. Once again, this is at odds with Einstein's metaphysics because it reinstates Maxwell's ether. Maxwell's electromagnetic theory requires a medium. How can you wave nothing? And again, people are concerned about the waving of nothing, and there we agree that we have to have something to talk about waves. And he adds, the Michelson-Morley basement experiment was heralded as having lain to rest the motion of an ether. It didn't. Dayton Miller carried out far more rigorous repeats of that experiment at different locations and elevations. He found a residual which allowed him to conclude that ponderable bodies like the Earth dragged the ether with them. He was able to determine the relative motion of the solar system with respect to the ether. So what is Mr. Thornhill saying? Well, he believes in the ether, and he's proposing the ether after all these years. Electric universe is an ether theory, and there are other people who obviously propose the ether who are not part of the electric universe. The ether is not dead. And the main issue here is what physical object underlies light. And from the ancients, we've got, from the Upanishads, we've got earth, water, air, and fire. And then we added the ether, and the ether was put outside the moon. And this ether was some kind of mist, some kind of spirit, whatever it was that was out there. And Aristotle says it's got nothing to do with us here. But then, the philosophers that came after, they said, no, not quite. What's happening is that ether comes into our world, penetrates our bodies, and is what forms our souls. And slowly we got more, put the ether more into religion. And it wasn't until Newton, again, as we can see if we do a revision of what I talked about, it wasn't until Newton that the ether is brought back, and this time as the carrier of light. But Newton saw it as a medium through which the corpuscles of light traveled. the corpuscles vibrated the ether, okay, and they could do so because there was a different size in the particles that comprised the ether versus the particles that comprised the light. And what happened was, according to Newton, it was the density of the ether that bent light. Well, Maxwell says, you're wrong, Newton. Light is the vibration of the ether. Ether is what's vibrating. Michelson and Marty come in, 15 years later, and they say, forget you, Maxwell. There is no ether. We could not measure, any mist out there, any spirit, whatever you want to call it. We could not measure the ether. So we don't think there is an ether. Einstein agrees in 1905, but by 1920, he turns that around. He says, forget about what I said in 1905. In 1920, he says, general relativity cannot do without the ether. But the ether is not made of particles, maybe like Newton. He was kind of criticizing Newton there. So it's not made of little particles, and those particles do not have motion. The ether is a continuous entity. I guess block universe, whatever he had in mind. And Max Born said, look, forget about all this ether stuff. Forget about what underlies light. We can't figure it out. And they went into abstractions. Max Born says, look, we forget about, essentially they forgot about physics and they just went into abstractions. And what comes next? Well, what comes next is we reinvented the ether. We have here a couple papers, and the electric universe is one of them. They believe in the ether. So the ether has not died. It's still alive and well today. And that's all I can say. The ether is really necessary in the sense that we need some kind of medium for light. We need some kind of medium for light. And you could even say we need some kind of medium for gravity, okay? But for sure we need it for light, because light has the ability in the photoelectric effect to knock, supposedly even according to the official version, has the ability to knock electrons, get them to move, and that's how it creates this current, this electricity. So what hit the electron? An abstract concept? The vibration of nothing? No. The light has to have some kind of medium, invisible medium, that underlies it. They call it the ether, but then the question is, what is the ether? Is it, like Newton said, a bunch of particles that through which light passes? Or is it like Einstein said, a continuous medium that somehow vibrates, like Maxwell said? So today they haven't figured out the ether, but the only thing that ether stands for really in the minds of a lot of these people is that light cannot do without a medium. Light has to be the vibration of a medium. And some think of it as continuous, some think of it as discrete, as a bunch of particles, but you must have a medium. And then the official stance, I guess, I'm not sure if it's everybody agrees with that in officialdom in all of mathematical physics, but the official stance, as far as I'm concerned, is that light is the vibration of nothing. There is no medium. And so we have all these theories running around today. And with that, I'll see you on Sunday. Okay? So toodaloo. We'll see you Sunday. Bye-bye.